A court transformed. Lady Isabel of Westmere had spent a year running from the king's men, but when Sir Gareth Fitzrohan finally caught her, he did not tighten the chains. Instead, he smirked. "You have been running for a long time, my lady," he murmured. "Tell me, shall I let you keep running? Or do you wish to surrender?" Chapter 1. The Falcon's Flight. The wind whipped at Lady Isabel's cloak, a gray, swirling vortex against the bruised twilight sky. It mirrored the tempest inside her, a year-long storm of fear and defiance. She urged her mare, a sturdy, mud-splattered creature named Whisper, onward, the rhythmic thud of hooves on the sodden earth a frantic counterpoint to the pounding of her own heart. Westmere, her ancestral home, was a distant memory, a jewel swallowed by the encroaching darkness of the king's displeasure. She risked a glance over her shoulder. No pursuit yet, but the absence of visible threat was hardly a comfort. King Edmund's reach was long, his patience, unlike his mercy, seemingly endless. He had branded her a traitor, accused her of conspiring with the northern rebels, a lie spun from the venomous whispers of her cousin, Lord Elric. Elric, with his serpent smile and eyes that held the cold glint of ambition, had always coveted Westmere. Now, thanks to his carefully crafted betrayal, it was likely his. Isabel's fingers tightened on the reins, the worn leather digging into her palms. She was no fragile court lady, despite the fine silks she had once worn. Years spent riding the wild moors surrounding Westmere, hunting with her father, had given her a strength that belied her slender frame. Her hair, the color of raven's wings, was escaping its hastily tied braid, whipping around her face like dark, silken whips. Her eyes, a startling shade of emerald green, usually held a spark of laughter, but tonight they were shadowed with a fierce determination. She would not be captured. She would not be caged. The forest loomed ahead, a dense, ancient wood known as the Whisperwood, a place of legend and whispered fears. It was said to be haunted by the spirits of ancient kings, by restless souls who had died in forgotten battles. For Isabel, it was a sanctuary, a place where the king's men might hesitate to follow. The trees, their branches gnarled and twisted like the limbs of ancient, slumbering giants, offered a fragile promise of concealment. As Whisper plunged into the shadowed depths of the Whisperwood, Isabel felt a shiver crawl down her spine. It was not just the cold, damp air that seeped through her cloak, but something else, a primal unease that settled deep in her bones. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. Even the usual night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves under the paws of unseen creatures, were absent. It was as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting. She slowed Whisper to a walk, her senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe. Every rustle of leaves sounded like the stealthy approach of an enemy. She had learned to trust her instincts, honed by years of navigating the treacherous currents of court life. And those instincts were screaming at her now.
Danger.
She pulled Whisper to a halt beneath the sheltering branches of a massive oak, its trunk so wide it would take 3 men to encircle it. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a scent that usually brought her comfort, but tonight, it felt oppressive, suffocating. She dismounted, her movements stiff from hours in the saddle. She patted Whisper's neck, murmuring soothing words, her voice a low, calming hum. The mare nuzzled her shoulder, her warm breath a small comfort in the encroaching darkness. Isabel drew a small, silver dagger from her boot, the blade catching the faint moonlight that filtered through the dense canopy. It was a gift from her father, given to her on her 16th birthday. "For protection, my little falcon," he had said, his voice gruff with emotion. "May you never need to use it, but may it serve you well if you do." Her father. The thought of him brought a fresh wave of grief, a sharp, agonizing pain that pierced through the numbness of fear. He had been dead for 5 years, felled by a sudden fever that had swept through Westmere like a wildfire. Had he been alive, Elric would never have dared to make his move. Her father, a man of unwavering loyalty and fierce protectiveness, would have crushed him like the viper he was. A sudden snap of a twig nearby sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She whirled around, the dagger held aloft, her body poised for attack. But it was only a deer, its eyes wide and startled, its coat the color of moonlight on snow. It stared at her for a moment, then bounded away into the undergrowth, its movements swift and silent. Isabel let out a shaky breath, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She was jumpy, exhausted, her nerves stretched taut as a bowstring. She needed to rest, to find a safe place to spend the night. But where? The forest was vast, and she was utterly alone. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She pictured her mother's face, her gentle smile, her eyes full of unwavering love. Her mother had died when Isabel was just a child, but her memory remained a beacon of hope, a source of strength in the darkest of times. "Be strong, my little falcon," her mother's voice whispered in her memory.
"Be brave.
And never give up hope." Isabel opened her eyes, her resolve renewed. She would not give up. She would survive. She would find a way to clear her name, to reclaim her home. She would not let Elric win. She led Whisper deeper into the forest, following a narrow, overgrown path that seemed to lead nowhere. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, provided the only light, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on her eyes. She felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that she was being watched, followed. Suddenly, Whisper stopped, her ears pricked forward, her body tense. Isabel felt it too, a shift in the air, a subtle change in the forest silence. There was someone else out there. She could feel it. She drew her dagger again, her grip tight, her senses screaming a warning. She scanned the surrounding trees, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of her pursuer. And then she saw him. He emerged from the shadows like a phantom, a tall, imposing figure clad in dark, travel-stained clothes. He sat astride a magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the moonlight. The man's face was partially obscured by the shadows, but she could see the glint of steel at his hip, the outline of a broadsword strapped to his back. He was a warrior, no doubt about it. And he was looking directly at her. He spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. "Lost, my lady?" The question was innocent enough, but there was something in his tone, a hint of something she couldn't quite place, that sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was no ordinary encounter. This man was not a simple traveler, a lost woodsman. He was something else entirely. And he was dangerous. He had found her. And the hunt, she knew, had truly begun. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Mist. Isabel's hand tightened around the hilt of her dagger, the cold silver a small comfort against the sudden surge of fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She didn't lower the blade.
"Who are you?"
Her voice was surprisingly steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though the shadows still concealed much of his face. He remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves and the distant, mournful call of a night bird. The stallion shifted restlessly beneath him, its hooves pawing at the damp earth. The man seemed to be studying her, assessing her, as a predator might size up its prey. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through her. Finally, he spoke, his voice still low, but with a hint of amusement that grated on her nerves. "A simple question, my lady, deserves a simple answer. I am but a traveler, passing through these woods." Isabel scoffed, a sound that was more bravado than genuine disbelief. "In the dead of night? With a warhorse and a sword that could cleave a man in two? You expect me to believe that?" He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that could have been either acknowledgement or mockery. "Belief is a fragile thing, my lady. Easily shattered, easily manipulated. I ask only that you judge me by my actions, not by your preconceived notions." His words were carefully chosen, measured, and yet they felt like a veiled threat. She remembered the stories of wolves in sheep's clothing, of charming rogues who lured unsuspecting victims to their doom. My preconceived notions tell me that any man found wandering in the Whisperwood at this hour, armed as you are, is likely up to no good. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down her spine. Perhaps. Or perhaps I am simply seeking shelter from the storm. He gestured towards the sky, where dark clouds were gathering, obscuring the already faint moonlight. A storm is coming, my lady, and it will be a fierce one. His words were true enough. The wind had picked up, whipping through the trees with increasing ferocity. The air was heavy with the scent of rain. But Isabel was not about to be swayed by his apparent concern for her well-being. I am quite capable of finding my own shelter. Thank you. Are you? He shifted in the saddle, and for the first time, the moonlight caught his face, illuminating his features. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jawline, a straight nose, and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intensity. His hair was dark, almost black, and fell to his shoulders in thick waves. He was undeniably handsome, in a rugged, dangerous sort of way. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of storm clouds, a deep, swirling gray that seemed to hold both a hint of amusement and a chilling ruthlessness. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, despite the heavy armor he wore beneath his cloak. He approached her slowly, deliberately, like a wolf stalking its prey. Isabel instinctively took a step back, her hand still gripping the dagger. "Do not be afraid, my lady," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I mean you no harm." "Liar," she hissed, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. She knew she was being reckless, provoking him, but she couldn't help herself. Fear and anger warred within her, a volatile combination that threatened to consume her. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes never leaving hers. "I understand your suspicion. You are a woman alone, in a dangerous place. But I assure you, my intentions are honorable." "Honorable?" Isabel laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "A knight of the king, hunting a woman accused of treason, speaks of honor? Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe." His eyes narrowed slightly, the amusement fading, replaced by a flicker of something else. Annoyance? Or perhaps something darker, more dangerous. "You know who I am, then?" "I know what you are," she corrected, her voice dripping with contempt. "A hound of the king, sent to drag me back to his kennels." He remained silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, he slowly drew his sword, the steel gleaming in the faint moonlight. Isabel tensed, her body ready to spring, to fight, even though she knew it was a futile gesture. She was no match for a seasoned warrior, armed with a blade that could easily sever her own small dagger in two. But he didn't attack. Instead, he held the sword out to her, hilt first. "Take it," he said, his voice a low murmur. Isabel stared at him, her mind reeling. This made no sense. Why would he offer her his weapon? Was it a trick? A trap? "What game are you playing?" "No game, my lady," he replied, his voice strangely sincere. "I offer you my sword as a sign of my good faith, a pledge of my protection." She hesitated, her mind struggling to make sense of his actions. This went against everything she had expected, everything she had been prepared for. She had anticipated a fight, a chase, a desperate struggle for survival. But this was something else entirely.
"Why?"
she whispered, the word barely audible above the rising wind. He lowered the sword slightly, but still held it out to her. "Because," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I believe you are innocent." The words hung in the air. The storm was brewing. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Snare. Isabel stared at the offered sword, the polished steel reflecting the faint, flickering light of the moon, now barely visible through the racing clouds. Her mind, a whirlwind of suspicion and disbelief, struggled to reconcile the image of the king's hunter with the man who stood before her, offering her his weapon, claiming to believe in her innocence. It was a ludicrous proposition, a blatant contradiction of everything she knew about the ruthless efficiency of King Edmund's men. "You expect me to believe that?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. You, a knight sworn to serve the king, believe the word of a woman he has branded a traitor? Sir Gareth, for she now recalled his name, whispered among the court with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Sir Gareth Fitzrohan, the king's most trusted and most feared enforcer, did not flinch. His gray eyes, those unsettling storm cloud eyes, held hers with an unwavering intensity. I believe what I see, my lady, he said, his voice low and steady. And what I see is not a traitor, but a woman unjustly accused. And what exactly do you see? She challenged, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain a facade of strength. He lowered the sword a fraction, but still held it out towards her. I see fear, yes, but not the fear of a guilty conscience. I see defiance, but not the defiance of a rebel. I see pain. He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. The pain of loss, of betrayal. The pain of a woman who has been wronged. His words, so unexpected, so perceptive, struck a chord deep within her. He had seen through the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart, the defenses she had erected against the world. It was unnerving, unsettling, and yet strangely compelling. You know nothing of my pain, she retorted, her voice sharper than she intended. Perhaps not, he conceded. But I know something of betrayal, of loss. His voice held a hint of a darkness, a shadow of a past that she could only guess at. It was a fleeting glimpse, quickly masked, but it was enough to make her wonder about the man behind the knight, the hunter behind the king's loyal servant. The wind howled around them, whipping their cloaks and stirring the leaves into a frenzy. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering on the forest floor. The storm was upon them. Take the sword, Lady Isabel, Gareth urged, his voice cutting through the rising wind. We must find shelter. We can talk more once we are out of the storm. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to run, to escape while she still had the chance. But another part of her, a small, fragile voice of hope, whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, he was telling the truth. Or a cynical thought, a truth of convenience. Her fingers, numb with cold, slowly reached out and closed around the hilt of the sword. It was heavier than she expected, the weight of the steel a tangible reminder of the power it represented. She held it awkwardly, unfamiliar with its balance, its deadly potential. Gareth watched her, his expression unreadable. He made no move to stop her, no move to reclaim his weapon. He simply stood there, patiently waiting. Where? She asked, the word a barely audible whisper against the roar of the wind. He gestured with his head towards a barely discernible path, leading deeper into the heart of the whisperwood. There is a cave, not far from here. It will provide some shelter. He turned and walked towards the path, confident that she would follow. And she did, though not without a lingering sense of unease. She kept the sword pointed towards his back, ready to strike if he made any sudden moves. But he did not. He walked with a steady, measured pace, his broad shoulders a reassuring presence in the gathering darkness. The cave was small, barely more than a shallow indentation in the rocky hillside, but it was dry, and it offered some protection from the wind and rain. Gareth quickly gathered some dry leaves and twigs and, using a flint and steel from his pouch, started a small fire. The flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls, providing a welcome warmth and a semblance of light. Isabel sat down on a smooth, flat rock near the entrance of the cave, still clutching Gareth's sword. She watched him as he tended to the horses, securing them to a nearby tree, his movements efficient and practiced. He moved with the grace of a seasoned warrior, his every action betraying a lifetime spent in the saddle and on the battlefield. He returned to the cave, his cloak soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He shook himself like a large dog, sending droplets of water flying. Then, he sat down opposite her, across the small fire, his gray eyes meeting hers. Now, he said, his voice calm and steady, tell me, Lady Isabel, tell me why you are running. The story was about to begin. The hunter was listening, his trap, of words, perhaps, or of something much more complicated, laid. Chapter 4. A Cage of Gilded Bars. The fire crackled merrily, casting a warm, flickering glow on the damp cave walls. Outside, the storm raged, a symphony of wind and rain that mirrored the tempest inside Isabel. She looked at Sir Gareth, his face illuminated by the firelight, his gray eyes fixed on hers, waiting. He had asked a simple question, yet it held the weight of a year's worth of fear, flight, and carefully guarded secrets. She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. Trust was a luxury she could not afford, especially not with a man like him, a knight sworn to the very king who had condemned her. Yet, there was something in his gaze, a sincerity, a hint of understanding, that chipped away at her defenses. And, she admitted to herself, she was tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of the constant fear that gnawed at her soul. It started with a whisper, she began, her voice low and strained. A rumor, planted like a poisonous seed, that I was conspiring with the northern rebels. Gareth nodded, his expression unchanged. I have heard the whispers. They were lies, Isabel said, her voice rising with a surge of anger. Fabricated by my cousin, Lord Elric. He coveted Westmere, my ancestral home. He saw an opportunity to seize it, and he took it. And the king believed him? Gareth asked, his voice betraying a hint of skepticism. Isabel laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. King Edmund is a complicated man. He values loyalty above all else. But his loyalty is easily swayed by those who know how to manipulate him. Elric is a master of such manipulation. She paused, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm within her. She recounted the events of the past year, the accusations, the trial a mockery of justice, presided over by Elric himself, the king's swift condemnation, and her desperate escape, aided by a handful of loyal servants who had risked their own lives to help her. I have been running ever since, she concluded, her voice barely a whisper. Living in the shadows, relying on the kindness of strangers, always looking over my shoulder. Gareth listened intently, his gaze never leaving hers. He did not interrupt, did not offer platitudes or false reassurances. He simply listened, allowing her to unburden herself, to release the pent-up emotions that had been festering within her for so long. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain against the cave entrance. "And you believe Elric is behind all of this?" he finally asked. "I know he is," Isabel said, her voice filled with conviction. "He has always hated me, resented me for inheriting Westmere. He saw this as his chance to finally get what he wanted." Gareth nodded slowly. "It is a plausible scenario. Lord Elric is known for his ambition." He paused, his gaze shifting to the fire. "But ambition alone is not enough to condemn a woman of your standing. There must have been evidence." Isabel's eyes flashed with anger. "Evidence? Fabricated letters, paid witnesses, twisted truths. Elric is a master of deceit. He knows how to play the game." "And you have proof of his treachery?" Gareth asked, his voice still calm, but with a hint of challenge. Isabel heshed at it. This was the crux of the matter, the reason she had been running for so long. "I did have proof," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A letter, written by Elric himself, outlining his plan. But I lost it." "Lost it?" Gareth's eyebrows rose slightly. "During my escape," Isabel explained. "It was in a small pouch, along with some other valuables. I must have dropped it somewhere along the way." Gareth was silent for a moment, his gaze searching hers. "So, you have no proof, other than your word?" Isabel felt a surge of frustration. "My word should be enough. I am Lady Isabel of Westmere. My family has served the crown loyally, for generations." "Loyalty is a fragile thing, my lady," Gareth said, his voice echoing his earlier words. "Especially in these times. The king is surrounded by enemies, both real and imagined. He cannot afford to take chances. But I am not his enemy," Isabel cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "I have never betrayed him. I would never betray him. Gareth's gaze softened slightly. He reached out and gently touched her hand, his fingers warm against her cold skin. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. I believe you, Lady Isabel, he said, his voice low and sincere. But believing is not enough. We need proof. We need to find that letter. His words, and the warmth that spread where they'd made contact, gave her a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the darkness that had surrounded her for so long. But even as hope blossomed, a chilling thought followed. If he truly believed her, what did that mean for his duty? What did that mean for her? He was still the king's man, and she was still a hunted woman, even inside a shared shelter. Chapter 5. The Serpent's Whisper. The warmth of Gareth's touch lingered on Isabel's skin, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled deep in her bones. His words, I believe you, echoed in her mind, a fragile melody against the cacophony of doubt and fear. But even as a flicker of hope ignited, the reality of their situation loomed large, a dark shadow threatening to extinguish the flame. If you believe me, Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly, then what? You are still a knight of the king. Your duty is to capture me, to bring me back to face his justice. She could barely force the last word out, the irony of it bitter on her tongue. Gareth withdrew his hand, the warmth vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He leaned back against the cave wall, his gray eyes studying the flickering flames of the fire. Duty is a heavy burden, my lady, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. A chain that binds us to obligations we may not always agree with. And your obligation is to the king, Isabel stated, her voice laced with a hint of accusation. He nodded slowly. It is. But duty is not always a simple path. There are complexities, nuances, that are not always apparent to those who stand on the outside. Complexities? Isabel scoffed. What complexities could possibly justify hunting an innocent woman? He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. The complexity of believing one thing while being sworn to uphold another. The complexity of serving a king who may be misled. Misled? Isabel repeated, her voice sharp. You think King Edmund is being manipulated? Gareth hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Let us say that he is susceptible to certain influences. Lord Elric is a powerful man with a strong voice at court. He has the king's ear. And you believe he has used that influence to poison the king's mind against me? It is a possibility, Gareth conceded. A strong possibility. Then what will you do? Isabel asked, her voice a desperate whisper. Will you betray your king? Gareth shook his head slowly. Betrayal is a dangerous word, my lady. One that carries heavy consequences. I will not betray my king. But I will also not blindly follow orders that I believe to be unjust. So, what will you do? Isabel pressed, her heart pounding in her chest. He met her gaze, his expression resolute. I will find the truth. I will find your letter, the proof of Elric's treachery. And I will present it to the king. Isabel stared at him, her mind reeling. This was a gamble, a dangerous game he was proposing. If he failed, if he could not find the letter, or if the king refused to believe him, they would both be condemned. And if the king does not believe you? She asked, her voice barely audible. Gareth's jaw tightened. Then we will face the consequences together. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was offering her an alliance, a partnership, a chance to fight for her freedom. But it was an alliance forged in danger, a partnership built on a foundation of mutual risk.
Why?
Isabel whispered, the question that had been burning in her mind since he had first offered her his sword. Why are you doing this? Why are you risking your own life for a woman you barely know, a woman accused of treason? Gareth looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a depth of emotion that she could not fathom. Because, he said, his voice low and intense, I see something in you, Lady Isabel. Something worth fighting for. Something pure. His words, so unexpected, so profoundly moving, sent a shiver down her spine. She felt a stirring within her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the man who sat across from her. It was a dangerous warmth, a forbidden attraction, a spark of something that could easily ignite into a conflagration. A sudden noise from outside the cave shattered the moment. A sharp, snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. Gareth instantly tensed, his hand moving to the hilt of the sword that lay beside him. Her sword, she realized with a jolt. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He rose to his feet, his movements fluid and silent, and moved towards the cave entrance, his senses on high alert. Isabel watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. Fear, raw and primal, gripped her once more. Had they been followed? Had Elric's men found them? Gareth peered out into the darkness, his body silhouetted against the faint, flickering light of the fire. He stood there for a long moment, listening, watching. Then he slowly relaxed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It is nothing," he said, turning back towards her. "Just an animal, I think." But Isabel wasn't convinced. She had heard the sound too, and it had sounded distinctly human. She had a sudden, chilling premonition, a feeling that they were not alone, that they were being watched. The serpent had whispered. And the game, whatever it truly was, had taken a decidedly darker turn. Chapter 6. Scars of the Past. Isabel remained unconvinced by Gareth's dismissal of the sound outside. The prickling unease persisted, a cold knot in her stomach. She watched him as he returned to his place by the fire, his movements seemingly relaxed, but she noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his hand lingered near his sword. No, his sword again. She reminded herself she had returned it to him before he'd checked outside. "Are you sure it was just an animal?" she asked, her voice low, barely a whisper above the crackling flames. Gareth met her gaze, his gray eyes unreadable in the flickering light. "Reasonably," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. He didn't lie, but he didn't offer reassurance either. It was a subtle admission, a tacit acknowledgement of her lingering fear. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the sounds of the storm, which was beginning to subside, the wind dying down to a low moan, the rain softening to a steady drizzle. Isabel found herself studying him, trying to decipher the man behind the knight, the hunter behind the reluctant ally. She noticed, for the first time, the faint lines etched around his eyes, the subtle weariness in his posture. He was young, yes, but he carried the weight of experiences that belied his age. There were scars, she realized, not just on his body. She had glimpsed a long, jagged scar on his forearm when he had rolled up his sleeve to tend the fire, but also on his soul. "You said you knew something of betrayal," she said, breaking the silence, her voice hesitant. "Of loss." Gareth's gaze shifted to the fire, his expression darkening slightly. He remained silent for a long moment, as if wrestling with some inner demon. "We all carry our burdens, Lady Isabel," he finally said, his voice low and somber. "Some are heavier than others." "What is your burden, Sir Gareth?" she asked softly, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. It was a bold question, perhaps even an inappropriate one, given their circumstances. But she felt a strange compulsion to know, to understand the man who had offered her his protection, his loyalty, his sword. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. He seemed to be weighing her question, deciding whether to answer, whether to trust her with a glimpse into his past. "My burden," he said slowly, "is a broken oath. A promise I made and failed to keep." Isabel's heart ached for him, for the pain she heard in his voice, the shadow of regret that darkened his eyes. "To whom did you make this promise?" He hesitated, then spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "To my wife." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Isabel felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, surprise, certainly, but also a strange, unsettling sense of disappointment. It was an irrational feeling, she knew, given her own precarious situation. But it was there nonetheless. "You are married?" she asked, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Gareth shook his head.
Was.
"She is gone." I am sorry," Isabel stammered, feeling a rush of empathy for him. She knew the pain of loss, the emptiness that remained when a loved one was taken too soon. He nodded, a brief, curt gesture. "It was many years ago," he said, his voice distant. "She died in childbirth. Along with our child." Isabel's breath caught in her throat. The depth of his loss, the sheer tragedy of it, struck her with a force that left her reeling. She could not imagine the pain he must have endured, the guilt he must have carried. "What was your oath?" she asked softly, her voice filled with compassion. Gareth looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, unmasked grief that made her heart ache. "I promised to protect her," he said, his voice choked with emotion.
To keep her safe.
"And I failed." He turned away, staring into the fire, his body rigid with tension. Isabel understood, with a clarity that surprised her, the source of his relentless drive, his unwavering commitment to duty, his willingness to risk his own life for a stranger. He was seeking redemption, trying to atone for a past he could not change, a promise he could not keep. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her fingers resting lightly on his sleeve. It was a gesture of comfort, of understanding, of shared pain. He did not pull away. "It was not your fault," she said softly. "Sometimes, fate deals us blows we cannot prevent. We cannot control everything." He turned to her, his gray eyes searching hers, a flicker of something akin to hope in their depths. "Perhaps," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but we can choose how we respond. We can choose to fight, to endure, to atone." And she knew he was choosing to fight for her, to atone through her. But the night was not yet over. Chapter 7. Beneath a Hollow Moon. The silence that followed Gareth's confession was thick with unspoken emotions. Isabel's hand remained on his arm, a fragile connection between two wounded souls. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the cave walls. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world and a sky filled with a million glittering stars. A sliver of a moon, pale and hollow, hung low in the sky, casting an ethereal glow on the landscape. Isabel withdrew her hand, the warmth of his arm lingering on her fingertips. She felt a profound shift in their relationship, a deepening of understanding, a bond forged in shared pain and in nascent trust. But she also knew that the path ahead was still fraught with danger, that their alliance was a fragile one, easily shattered by the forces arrayed against them. "We should try to get some rest," Gareth said, his voice breaking the silence. "We have a long journey ahead of us." He was right. They needed to find the lost letter, the proof of Elric's treachery. And they needed to do it before Elric discovered their alliance, before he could tighten his grip on the king, before he could silence them both forever. Isabel nodded, her mind already racing, planning their next move. "Where do you think we should start?" Gareth leaned back against the cave wall, his gaze thoughtful. "We need to retrace your steps," he said. "Think back to your escape from Westmere. Where did you go?
Who did you see?
Where could you have lost the letter?" Isabel closed her eyes, trying to conjure up the memories of that terrifying night, a year ago. It was a blur of fear and adrenaline, a desperate flight through darkness and danger. "I remember riding for hours," she said slowly. "Through the forest, across the moors. I stopped at a small village, near the border Oakhaven, I think it was called. I asked for help, for shelter. A kind old woman took me in, gave me food and a place to sleep." "Did you have the letter with you then?" Gareth asked, his voice intent. Isabel frowned, trying to recall. I think so. I remember checking my pouch, making sure it was still there. But I'm not sure."
It was all so chaotic.
"Oakhaven," Gareth repeated, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "It's a small village, not far from the border. A good place to start." He rose to his feet, stretching his stiff muscles. "We should leave at first light." Isabel nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The journey would be perilous, fraught with risks. But for the first time in a long time, she did not feel alone. She had an ally, a protector, a man who believed in her, a man who was willing to risk his own life to help her. She lay down on the cold, hard floor of the cave, using her cloak as a makeshift pillow. Gareth remained by the entrance, keeping watch, his silhouette outlined against the starry sky. He was a silent guardian, a watchful presence, a reassuring reminder that she was not alone in this fight. Sleep, however, eluded her. Her mind was too active, too filled with worries and uncertainties. She thought about Elric, his cruel smile, his cold, calculating eyes. She thought about the king, a man she had once respected, now a pawn in her cousin's treacherous game. And she thought about Gareth, his scarred past, his broken oath, his unwavering determination to help her. She found herself drawn to him, to his strength, his resilience, his quiet compassion. It was a dangerous attraction, a forbidden yearning, a spark of something that could easily ignite into a flame. But she could not deny it, could not suppress the feelings that were stirring within her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, to find some respite from the turmoil within her. But even in the darkness, she could still see his face, his gray eyes, his enigmatic smile. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, Isabel finally drifted off into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of running, of hiding, of being pursued. But in her dreams, she was no longer alone. A tall, dark-haired knight rode beside her, his hand outstretched, his eyes filled with a promise of protection, of hope, of something more. And in that sliver of dreaming, as the hollow moon gave way to dawn, she felt safe. But outside, the world was waiting. Chapter 8. The Price of Freedom. The journey to Oakhaven was arduous, a slow, winding trek through rugged terrain and dense forests. Isabel and Gareth rode in silence for the most part, their conversation limited to practical matters: the route, the supplies, the potential dangers. Yet, beneath the surface of their quiet companionship, a subtle tension simmered, an unspoken awareness of the growing connection between them. Isabel found herself stealing glances at Gareth, observing the way he sat his horse, the way his eyes scanned the horizon, the way his hand rested on the hilt of his sword. He was a warrior, born and bred, but there was a gentleness about him, a quiet strength that drew her to him. She remembered the warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his eyes, the pain that shadowed his past. He was a complex man, a man of contradictions, a man who had captured her attention, and perhaps a part of her heart. They reached Oakhaven late in the afternoon, a small, unassuming village nestled in a valley, surrounded by rolling hills and fields of ripening grain. It was a peaceful scene, a stark contrast to the turmoil that roiled within Isabel. "We should be careful," Gareth cautioned, as they approached the village. "Elric may have spies here. We cannot afford to draw attention to ourselves." Isabel nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. This was where she had sought refuge a year ago, where she had hoped to find safety, where she might have lost the letter that held the key to her freedom. They decided to pose as travelers, seeking shelter for the night. Gareth, with his noble bearing and commanding presence, easily assumed the role of a lord traveling with his sister. Isabel, despite her initial reluctance, played along, adopting a demure demeanor, keeping her eyes downcast, allowing Gareth to do most of the talking. They found lodging at a small inn, a modest establishment with a thatched roof and a welcoming fire in the common room. The innkeeper, a stout, jovial man with a ruddy complexion, seemed unsuspecting, readily offering them a room and a simple meal of stew and bread. Isabel felt a pang of guilt at the deception, but she knew it was necessary. They could not afford to trust anyone, not until they had found the letter, not until they had exposed Elric's treachery. After they had eaten, Gareth suggested they make inquiries about the old woman Isabel had stayed with a year ago. Discreetly, of course, he cautioned. "We do not want to arouse suspicion." Isabel nodded, her mind racing. She remembered the woman's name: Agnes. She had been a kind, gentle soul, with a wrinkled face and wise, knowing eyes. She had offered Isabel shelter without question, without judgment. They spent the evening mingling with the villagers in the common room, listening to their conversations, asking subtle questions, trying to glean any information they could about Agnes. It was a slow, frustrating process, but eventually, they learned that Agnes was still alive, living in a small cottage at the edge of the village. "We should visit her tomorrow morning," Gareth said, as they retired to their room. "It is our best chance of finding the letter." Isabel agreed, her heart filled with a fragile hope. But as she lay in the small, narrow bed, listening to Gareth's steady breathing from across the room, she could not shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She felt as though they were being watched, followed, that danger lurked just around the corner. She remembered the sound outside the cave, the snap of a twig that Gareth had dismissed as an animal. She remembered the way the villagers had looked at them, their eyes curious, perhaps even suspicious. She could not shake the feeling that Elric's reach extended even to this remote village, that his spies were everywhere. She slept little and awoke tired. The village seemed friendly. Too friendly. The price of freedom would clearly be high. Chapter 9. A Dance of Shadows. The morning dawned gray and overcast, mirroring Isabel's apprehension. The air was thick with a damp chill, and a light mist hung over the village, obscuring the surrounding hills. They ate a quick breakfast in silence, the unspoken tension between them palpable. As they walked towards Agnes's cottage, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced around nervously, scanning the faces of the villagers they passed, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint of suspicion. But everyone seemed preoccupied with their own affairs, their eyes averted, their faces impassive. Agnes's cottage was small and unassuming, nestled at the edge of the village, surrounded by a small garden overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. The thatched roof was sagging in places, and the walls were weathered and worn. It looked like a place forgotten by time, a refuge from the world. Gareth knocked on the wooden door, the sound echoing in the stillness. After a moment, the door creaked open, and Agnes stood before them, her wrinkled face etched with surprise. "Lady Isabel?" she whispered, her voice raspy with age. "Is it truly you?" Isabel stepped forward, her heart filled with a surge of relief. "Agnes, it's me. I need your help." Agnes's eyes, though clouded with age, still held a spark of warmth and kindness. She ushered them inside, her movements slow and deliberate. The cottage was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and tidy, with a fire burning merrily in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the room. "What troubles you, child?" Agnes asked, her voice gentle and concerned. Isabel explained their situation, her voice trembling with emotion. She told Agnes about Elric's treachery, about the lost letter, about their desperate search for proof of her innocence. Agnes listened intently, her gaze never leaving Isabel's face. When Isabel had finished, Agnes remained silent for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "I remember the night you came to me," she said slowly. "You were frightened, desperate. I gave you shelter, food, a place to rest. Do you remember a letter?" Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A small pouch. With some valuables?" Agnes hesitated, her eyes flickering towards Gareth, who stood silently by the door, his presence a reassuring reminder of their alliance. I remember you had a pouch," Agnes said slowly. "But I did not look inside. It was not my place." Isabel's heart sank. This was not the answer she had hoped for. But Agnes continued, her voice hesitant. "I remember you were very careful with it. You kept it close to you, even when you slept. You seemed afraid to let it out of your sight." Isabel frowned, trying to recall. She remembered clutching the pouch tightly, terrified of losing it. She had hidden it under her pillow when she slept, kept it tucked inside her cloak when she was awake. "I remember," Agnes said suddenly, her eyes widening slightly. "You went outside, in the middle of the night. You said you needed some air. You were gone for a long time." Isabel's mind raced. She had gone outside. She remembered feeling suffocated by the small cottage, overwhelmed by fear and anxiety. She had walked to the edge of the garden, to a small, secluded spot overlooking the valley. "I remember seeing you digging," Agnes said, her voice barely a whisper. "Under a large oak tree, at the edge of the garden. Isabel's heart leaped with a sudden surge of hope. She remembered. She had buried the pouch, intending to retrieve it later, when it was safe. She had been too afraid to keep it with her, too afraid of losing it. The tree, Isabel said, turning to Gareth, her voice filled with excitement. We need to find the tree. They rushed outside, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Isabel led the way, her memory guiding her to the spot she had chosen a year ago. The oak tree still stood there, tall and majestic, its branches reaching towards the sky like gnarled fingers. Gareth began to dig, his movements swift and efficient. Isabel watched him, her heart pounding with anticipation. The soil was damp and heavy, but he worked tirelessly, his muscles straining with the effort. After what seemed like an eternity, his shovel struck something hard. He knelt down, his hands carefully clearing away the soil. And then he lifted it out. A small, leather pouch, stained and weathered, but intact. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. It was the pouch. The letter. The proof of her innocence. But as she reached out to take it, a voice shattered the silence. Looking for something, my lady? They whirled around. Standing at the edge of the garden, a group of armed men surrounded them. And at their head, smiling a serpent's smile, stood Lord Elric. The dance was over. The shadows had won. Chapter 10. The Lion's Roar. Elric's smile was a predatory curve, a flash of white teeth against the backdrop of his grim-faced men. He was dressed in fine velvet, a stark contrast to the rough attire of his guards, and the sword at his hip gleamed with a malevolent light. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of dread that was almost paralyzing. Cousin, Isabel said, forcing a note of defiance into her voice. What a pleasant surprise. Elric chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent shivers down her spine. Indeed, my dear Isabel, I have been looking forward to this reunion. He gestured towards Gareth, who stood protectively in front of Isabel, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. And you have made a new friend, I see. A knight of the king, no less. How intriguing. Gareth remained silent, his gray eyes fixed on Elric, his body tense and ready for action. He knew, as Isabel did, that this was a trap, carefully laid and sprung. Elric had been expecting them, had known about their quest, had perhaps even orchestrated it from the beginning. What do you want, Elric? Isabel asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain a facade of strength. Elric's smile widened. Why, my dear cousin, I want what is rightfully mine. Westmere. And you, of course, as a prisoner of the king. You will never have Westmere, Isabel retorted, her voice filled with defiance. It is my ancestral home, and I will not let you steal it from me. Brave words, my lady, Elric said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, but ultimately futile. You are a traitor, accused of conspiring against the king. And your companion here, he gestured towards Gareth again, is guilty of aiding and abetting a known criminal. He will share your fate. Gareth stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. The Lady Isabel is innocent, Lord Elric.
You know that.
You fabricated the evidence against her. Elric laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Proof, Sir Knight? Do you have proof of my supposed treachery? Gareth held up the leather pouch. This is the proof. A letter, written by you, outlining your plan to frame Lady Isabel. Elric's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But he quickly recovered, his composure returning. A forgery, no doubt. Planted by you, to discredit me. Open it, Gareth challenged. Read it aloud. Let your men hear the truth. Elric hesitated. He knew that the letter was genuine, that it contained the damning evidence of his betrayal. But he could not afford to let his men see it, to let them doubt his authority. Enough of this charade, Elric said, his voice hardening.
Seize them.
His men moved forward, their swords drawn, their faces grim and determined. Gareth drew his own sword, the steel gleaming in the pale sunlight. He positioned himself between Isabel and the approaching guards, ready to defend her to the death. Run, Isabel, he shouted.
Get to safety.
But Isabel refused to leave his side. She drew a small dagger from her boot, the same dagger her father had given her, the blade a silver flash in the dim light. It was a pitiful weapon against the swords of Elric's men, but she would not abandon Gareth, would not leave him to face this danger alone. The fight was swift and brutal. Gareth, a seasoned warrior, fought with skill and ferocity, his sword a blur of motion, deflecting blows, striking out with deadly accuracy. But he was outnumbered, surrounded by a dozen armed men, and he could not hold them off forever. Isabel fought beside him, her dagger a desperate defense against the overwhelming odds. She managed to wound one of the guards, a shallow cut to his arm, but it was a futile gesture. Suddenly, a horn blew, a loud, clear blast that echoed through the valley. Elric's men hesitated, their attack faltering. They looked towards the village, their faces etched with confusion. From the direction of the village, a company of riders appeared, their armor gleaming in the sunlight, their banners flying high. They were King's men, led by a tall, imposing figure on a magnificent black stallion. It was not Elric's reinforcements, a figure Isabel knew. And at that moment, the lion roared, in the form of an unexpected arrival. It was the king himself. Chapter 11.
Broken Oaths.
The arrival of the king and his knights sent a wave of shock through Elric's men. They faltered, their attack breaking apart, their eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Elric himself stood frozen, his face pale, his carefully constructed facade of control crumbling before Isabel's eyes. King Edmund rode forward, his face a mask of grim authority. He surveyed the scene, his gaze sweeping over the battling figures, the drawn swords, the stunned faces of Elric's men. His eyes finally settled on Gareth, who stood battered and bruised, but still defiant, his sword protecting Isabel. "Stand down," the king roared, his voice echoing across the valley. "All of you." The fighting ceased instantly. Elric's men lowered their weapons, their faces etched with apprehension. Gareth remained on guard, his sword still raised, his eyes fixed on the king. "Sir Gareth," the king said, his voice calm but firm. "Explain yourself." Gareth stepped forward, his head held high. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice clear and strong, "I have come to present you with proof of Lord Elric's treachery. He has framed Lady Isabel of Westmere, accusing her of treason in order to seize her lands." He held up the leather pouch, the damning evidence of Elric's betrayal. "This letter, written by Elric himself, outlines his plan." The king's gaze shifted to Elric, his eyes narrowing. "Is this true, Elric?" Elric stammered, his voice trembling, his usual arrogance gone. "Your Majesty, it is a lie, a forgery. Sir Gareth is the traitor, aiding a known criminal." "Silence," the king thundered. He gestured to one of his knights, a trusted captain named Sir Reginald. "Take the letter. Read it aloud." Sir Reginald took the pouch, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it, carefully extracting the folded parchment. He began to read, his voice clear and steady, the words of Elric's treachery echoing across the valley. As the letter was read, the faces of Elric's men changed. Their initial shock and disbelief gave way to anger and disgust. They had been used, manipulated, their loyalty betrayed by the man they had sworn to serve. Elric stood silent, his head bowed, his face hidden in shadow. He knew that he was finished, that his carefully constructed web of lies had been exposed. When Sir Reginald had finished reading, the king turned to Elric, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "You have betrayed my trust, Elric," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have abused your power. You have framed an innocent woman. You have stained the honor of your house." Elric looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "Your Majesty, I can explain. There is nothing to explain," the king said, his voice cutting like steel. "Your guilt is clear. You are stripped of your titles, your lands, your possessions. You are banished from my kingdom, never to return." He turned to Gareth, his gaze softening slightly. "Sir Gareth," he said, "you have served me well. You have shown courage, loyalty, and a commitment to justice. I commend you. He then turned to Isabel, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and apology. Lady Isabel, he said, his voice gentle, I have wronged you. I allowed myself to be deceived by a treacherous man. I offer you my sincere apologies, and I restore to you your lands, your titles, your honor. Isabel stood tall, her head held high, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and vindication. Thank you, your majesty, she said, her voice clear and strong. The king nodded, then turned back to his knights. Take Elric into custody, he ordered, and see that Lady Isabel is escorted safely back to Westmere. As Elric was being led away, his face a mask of defeat and despair, Isabel felt a pang of not pity, but perhaps a sense of closure. The man who had tried to destroy her, who had stolen her freedom, who had caused her so much pain, was finally brought to justice. Gareth approached her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Something warmer, something deeper. It is over, he said softly. You are free. Isabel nodded, her heart overflowing with emotion. Thanks to you, she said, her voice trembling slightly.
You saved me.
He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him look even more handsome. We saved each other, he said. The king, interrupting the moment, cleared his throat. Sir Gareth, the king said a word. The broken oaths had been addressed. A new oath was about to be forged. Chapter 12. The Heart's Citadel. Gareth bowed his head to the king and stepped away from Isabel, leaving her standing amidst the swirling aftermath of the confrontation. The king dismounted, his movements deliberate and regal, and gestured for Gareth to walk with him a short distance away, out of earshot of the others. Isabel watched them, her heart a knot of anxiety and anticipation. What was the king saying to Gareth? Was he reprimanding him for disobeying his orders, for taking matters into his own hands?
Or was he thanking him?
She couldn't decipher their expressions from this distance. The king's face was impassive, his usual mask of authority firmly in place. Gareth's back was to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself rigidly erect. While they spoke, Sir Reginald approached Isabel, his expression respectful. My lady, he said, bowing slightly, His Majesty has ordered me to escort you back to Westmere. We can leave whenever you are ready. Isabel nodded, her mind still preoccupied with Gareth. Thank you, Sir Reginald. I will be ready shortly. She turned her attention back to the king and Gareth, her eyes searching for any clue as to the nature of their conversation. After what seemed like an eternity, the king clapped Gareth on the shoulder, a gesture that seemed to convey approval, perhaps even gratitude. Gareth bowed again, then turned and walked back towards Isabel. His face was unreadable, his gray eyes veiled, his expression carefully neutral. Isabel felt a surge of apprehension. What had the king said to him? What was going to happen now? What did he say? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gareth hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He thanked me, he said slowly, for uncovering the truth, for saving you. Relief washed over Isabel, a wave of warmth that eased the tension in her chest. But there was still something else, something unspoken, that hung in the air between them.
And?
She pressed, her heart pounding in her chest. And, Gareth continued, his voice low and hesitant, he has offered me a new position.
A promotion.
What kind of position? Isabel asked, her voice trembling slightly. He has named me Warden of the Western Marches, Gareth said, his eyes fixed on hers. Responsible for the security of the entire region, including Westmere. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. This was unexpected. It meant that Gareth would be staying, that he would be a permanent presence in her life. It was a prospect that both thrilled and terrified her. So you'll be staying? She asked, her voice barely audible. Gareth nodded slowly. Yes, he said, his voice soft. If that is acceptable to you. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. He was asking her, seeking her approval, her consent. It was a subtle gesture, but it spoke volumes about his respect for her, his recognition of her as an equal. Of course, it is acceptable, she said, her voice stronger now, filled with a newfound confidence. Westmere needs a strong protector. And I need you. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She had admitted it, finally, her feelings for him, the attraction that had been simmering between them since their first encounter in the Whisperwood. Gareth's gray eyes softened, a flicker of warmth, of tenderness, replacing the usual guarded expression. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. "And I need you, Isabel," he said, his voice low and intense. "More than you know." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent shivers down her spine. It was a kiss of promise, of hope, of a future they would build together, a future free from fear, from betrayal, from the shadows of the past. It was a gentle kiss, but it was also a binding one. The heart citadel, once so heavily guarded, had finally opened its gates. Chapter 13. Whispers of Treason. The journey back to Westmere was a triumphant procession. News of Isabel's exoneration and Elric's downfall had spread like wildfire, carried on the wings of the wind, whispered from village to village, celebrated with bonfires and cheers. The people of Westmere, who had lived under Elric's oppressive rule for the past year, welcomed her with open arms, their faces alight with joy and relief. Isabel, riding at the head of the procession, felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of gratitude, vindication, and a profound sense of homecoming. Westmere was more than just a castle, more than just land and titles. It was her heritage, her responsibility, her heart. Gareth rode beside her, his presence a constant source of strength and reassurance. He had shed his formal armor, opting for simpler, more comfortable attire, but he still carried himself with the bearing of a warrior, a protector, a leader. Their relationship had shifted, transformed by the shared danger, the unspoken promises, the kiss that had sealed their bond. As they approached the castle gates, Isabel saw a familiar figure waiting for them, a woman with silver hair and a kind, welcoming smile. It was Alara, her old nursemaid, the woman who had raised her, who had been a constant source of love and support throughout her life. Isabel rushed forward, embracing Alara tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Alara, I'm home." Alara held her close, her voice choked with emotion. "My dear child, you are safe. You are home. I knew you would return." The reunion was bittersweet, filled with joy and relief, but also with the lingering pain of the past year, the memories of fear and uncertainty. Isabel introduced Gareth to Alara, explaining his role in her rescue, his new position as Warden of the Western Marches. Alara welcomed him with warmth and gratitude, her eyes filled with a knowing understanding. The first few days at Westmere were a whirlwind of activity. Isabel had to reassert her authority, deal with the remnants of Elric's loyalists, restore order to the estate, and reassure her people that she was back, that she would protect them, that she would rebuild what had been broken. Gareth was by her side every step of the way, offering advice, support, and his unwavering strength. He was a natural leader, respected by the guards, trusted by the servants, admired by the people. He was quickly becoming an integral part of Westmere, of Isabel's life. But even as they worked to rebuild, to heal, to create a new future, a shadow of unease lingered. There were whispers, rumors, hints of discontent among some of the neighboring lords, those who had benefited from Elric's rule, those who resented Isabel's return, those who still harbored ambitions of their own. One evening, as Isabel and Gareth sat together in the great hall, reviewing reports from the outlying villages, a messenger arrived, bearing a sealed letter. The messenger was pale and shaken, his eyes wide with fear. "My lady," he stammered, "this letter it was found nailed to the door of the chapel in Oakhaven. It speaks of treason." Isabel's heart sank. She took the letter, her hands trembling slightly. She broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, her eyes scanning the words. The letter was unsigned, written in a crude, almost illegible hand. It accused Isabel of conspiring with Gareth to overthrow the king, of plotting to seize the throne for themselves. It called on the loyal lords of the realm to rise up against her, to restore order, to prevent another civil war. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. This was a dangerous accusation, a blatant attempt to undermine her authority, to sow discord, to incite rebellion. Who would write such a thing? She whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Gareth took the letter, his eyes scanning the words, his expression hardening. Someone who wants to see you fail, he said, his voice grim. Someone who still harbors loyalty to Elric, or someone who has their own ambitions. But who? Isabel pressed, her mind racing. Who would dare to make such a false accusation? Gareth hesitated, his gaze thoughtful. There are several possibilities, he said slowly. Lord Barlock, for one. He was a close ally of Elric's, and he has never hidden his dislike for you. Or Lord Arion. He has always coveted the Western Marches, and he may see this as an opportunity to seize control. Isabel looked around the great hall. Suddenly, everything seemed different. The whispers of treason were real. And very, very close. Chapter 14. The Falcon's Return. The letter cast a long shadow over Westmere. The joyous atmosphere of Isabel's return was replaced by a sense of unease, of suspicion, of impending danger. Isabel and Gareth knew that they had to act quickly, to identify the author of the letter, to expose the conspiracy before it could gain momentum. They spent hours poring over the letter, analyzing the handwriting, the language, the phrasing, searching for any clue that might reveal the author's identity. They questioned the messenger, interrogated the guards, reviewed reports from their spies, but found nothing concrete, nothing that pointed to a specific suspect. It could be anyone, Isabel said, her voice filled with frustration. Any one of the neighboring lords, any one of Elric's former allies, any one of the disgruntled factions within the kingdom. We need to narrow it down, Gareth said, his voice grim. We need to find some evidence, some connection, something that links the letter to a specific individual. They decided to focus their efforts on the two most likely suspects, Lord Barlock and Lord Arion. Both men had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to write the letter, to spread the rumors, to incite rebellion. Gareth dispatched his most trusted scouts to gather intelligence on Barlock and Arion, to monitor their movements, to intercept their communications, to uncover any evidence of their involvement. Isabel, meanwhile, used her own network of contacts, her knowledge of court politics, her understanding of the rivalries and alliances within the kingdom, to gather information, to assess the threat, to identify potential allies. She also decided to reach out to the king, to inform him of the letter, to reassure him of her loyalty, to request his support. She knew that she was walking a fine line, that any misstep could be interpreted as an admission of guilt, but she had no choice. She needed the king's backing, his authority, to counter the accusations, to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. She wrote a carefully worded letter to King Edmund, explaining the situation, outlining the evidence she had gathered, and requesting a meeting to discuss the matter further. She entrusted the letter to Alara, who had proven to be a reliable and trustworthy confidant. Alara, Isabel said, handing her the sealed letter, this is of utmost importance. You must deliver it to the king personally, and you must make sure that no one else sees it. Alara nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. I will not fail you, my lady, she said, her voice firm. As Alara prepared for her journey, Isabel felt a flicker of hope. She had taken the first steps, initiated the necessary actions, set in motion a plan to counter the threat, to protect her position, to defend her honor. But she also knew that the path ahead was fraught with danger, that her enemies were cunning and ruthless, that the whispers of treason could easily escalate into open rebellion. She found herself thinking of her father, of his strength, his wisdom, his unwavering commitment to justice. She remembered his words, spoken to her on her 16th birthday, when he had given her the silver dagger. For protection, my little falcon. May you never need to use it, but may it serve you well if you do. She drew the dagger from her boot, the blade gleaming in the candlelight. It was a small weapon, a fragile defense against the forces arrayed against her. But it was also a symbol of her heritage, her strength, her determination to fight for what was right, to protect what was hers. She looked at Gareth, who stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, his face etched with concern. He was her protector, her ally, her love. He had risked his life for her, stood by her side through thick and thin, believed in her when no one else did. She walked towards him, her hand resting on the hilt of the dagger. "We will face this together," she said, her voice firm. "We will not let them win." He looked to her. She was not the frightened woman of the woods anymore. She was the falcon, returned, and ready to fight. Chapter 15. A Knight's Confession. Gareth turned from the window, his gray eyes meeting Isabel's with a mixture of concern and admiration. He saw the determination in her stance, the fire in her eyes, the unwavering resolve that had replaced the fear and uncertainty of the past year. She was a true lady of Westmere, a leader, a fighter, a woman worthy of respect and admiration. "And love. We will," he agreed, his voice firm. He reached out and gently took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver of reassurance through her. "We will face this together. And we will win." They stood there for a moment, their hands clasped, their eyes locked, a silent connection between them, a bond forged in shared danger, in mutual respect, in a love that had blossomed amidst the turmoil and uncertainty. "I have been thinking," Gareth said, breaking the silence, his voice low and thoughtful, "about the letter, about the accusations, about who might be behind it." Isabel nodded, her gaze searching his. And I think," he continued, his voice hesitant, "that it might be more than just a simple power grab. It might be something more personal." "What do you mean?" Isabel asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Gareth hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if he were reluctant to voice his thoughts. "I mean," he said slowly, "that it might be someone who resents our relationship. Someone who sees me as an obstacle, a threat, a rival." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. She understood what he was implying. The letter could be a way to discredit not only her, but also Gareth, to remove him from his position as warden, to separate them, to destroy their burgeoning love. "You think someone is jealous?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gareth nodded, his gray eyes meeting hers again, a flicker of something akin to pain in their depths. "It is possible," he said. "There are those who might see our closeness as a threat. To their own ambitions, to their own desires." Isabel felt a pang of guilt. She had not considered this possibility, had not realized that her relationship with Gareth could be a source of resentment, of envy, of danger. She had been so focused on clearing her name, on reclaiming her position, on rebuilding Westmere, that she had neglected to consider the personal implications of their alliance, of their love. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Who would be so jealous?" Gareth hesitated again, his gaze shifting away. "There are several possibilities," he said slowly. "Lord Arian, as we discussed. He has always been ambitious, and he may see you as a prize to be won. Or Lady Lyra." The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lady Lyra was a powerful noblewoman, known for her beauty, her ambition, and her interest in Gareth. She had made no secret of her admiration for him, had even hinted at a desire for a closer relationship. Isabel felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but more a sense of unease, of apprehension, of a threat to something precious, something fragile, something she was only just beginning to understand. "Lady Lyra?" she repeated, her voice questioning. Gareth nodded, his expression grim. "She has been persistent," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She has made her feelings known to me. On several occasions." "And you?" Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. "What did you say to her?" Gareth met her gaze, his gray eyes filled with a sincerity that eased her fears, that reassured her, that reaffirmed his love for her. "I told her," he said, his voice low and firm, "that my heart belongs to another. That I am devoted to you, Isabel. And only you." He held her gaze. And this time, it wasn't just a confession of loyalty. It was a confession of love. A Knight's Confession, and The Truest Kind. Chapter 16. The Weight of Crowns. Gareth's words hung in the air, a balm to Isabel's anxieties, a reaffirmation of the bond that had grown between them, a promise of a future she had only dared to dream of. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the warmth of his skin a tangible reminder of his presence, his strength, his love. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
"For everything."
He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him look even more handsome. He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken vows, a kiss that spoke of passion, of devotion, of a love that would endure. But the moment of intimacy was short-lived. The weight of their responsibilities, the threat that loomed over them, the whispers of treason that echoed through the halls of Westmere could not be ignored. They had a conspiracy to unravel, a kingdom to protect, a love to defend. "We need to be careful," Gareth said, his voice serious, his gaze searching hers. "Lady Lyra is a powerful woman, with connections at court. If she is behind this, she will not hesitate to use them." Isabel nodded, her mind already racing, planning their next move. "We need to gather more information," she said. "We need to find proof of her involvement, or anyone else's, before we make any accusations." They decided to divide their efforts. Gareth would continue to investigate Lord Arian, using his network of scouts and informants to gather intelligence, to monitor his movements, to uncover any evidence of his complicity. Isabel, meanwhile, would focus on Lady Lyra, using her knowledge of court politics, her understanding of the rivalries and alliances within the kingdom, to assess the threat, to identify potential allies, to gather information discreetly. Isabel also decided to send a message to a trusted friend at court, Lady Annalise, a woman known for her wisdom, her discretion, and her loyalty to the king. Isabel hoped that Annalise could provide some insight into Lady Lyra's activities, her connections, her ambitions. The following days were filled with a tense, quiet urgency. Isabel and Gareth worked tirelessly, separately and together, gathering information, analyzing clues, piecing together the puzzle of the conspiracy. They spoke in hushed tones, met in secret, trusted only a handful of loyal servants. One evening, as Isabel sat alone in her chambers, reviewing reports from her spies, a messenger arrived, bearing a sealed letter from Lady Annalise. Isabel broke the seal eagerly, her heart pounding with anticipation. Annalise's letter was brief, but informative. She confirmed that Lady Lyra had been unusually active at court, meeting with several influential lords, whispering in corners, spreading rumors. She also mentioned that Lady Lyra had been seen in the company of a man known to be a close associate of Lord Barlock, the other prime suspect in the conspiracy. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. This was a significant development, a potential link between Lady Lyra and Lord Barlock, a sign that they might be working together, plotting against her, against Gareth, against the king. She immediately sought out Gareth, sharing the contents of Annalise's letter with him. He listened intently, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold determination. "This is it," he said, his voice low and firm. "This is the connection we've been looking for. Lady Lyra and Lord Barlock, working together. It's a conspiracy, no doubt about it."
"But why?"
Isabel asked, her voice filled with frustration. "What do they hope to gain?" Gareth hesitated, his gaze thoughtful. "Power," he said slowly. "Influence. Perhaps even the throne." Isabel's eyes widened. "The throne?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "You think they are plotting to overthrow the king?" Gareth nodded, his expression grim. "It's a possibility," he said. "A dangerous possibility. The king is vulnerable, his authority weakened by the recent turmoil. They may see this as an opportunity to seize control." Isabel looked down. It was not just her crown at Westmere that felt heavy. It was the weight of the entire kingdom's crown, and the threat it represented. Chapter 17. Flames of Rebellion. The revelation that Lady Lyra and Lord Barlock might be plotting to overthrow the king sent a wave of alarm through Isabel and Gareth. They knew that they had to act swiftly, decisively, to prevent the conspiracy from escalating into open rebellion, to protect the king, to safeguard the realm. They decided to take their findings to King Edmund, to present him with the evidence they had gathered, to warn him of the impending danger. They knew that it was a risky move, that they could be accused of treason themselves, but they had no choice. The stakes were too high, the threat too imminent. They prepared for their journey to the capital, gathering their evidence, assembling a small, trusted escort, and steeling themselves for the confrontation that lay ahead. Isabel knew that this would be a test of their loyalty, their courage, their love. As they rode towards the capital, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling of foreboding that settled over her. The landscape seemed to mirror her inner turmoil, the skies overcast, the wind cold and biting, the trees bare and skeletal. They arrived at the capital under the cover of darkness, seeking a secret audience with the king. Gareth, using his connections and his reputation, managed to secure a meeting with King Edmund in his private chambers, late at night, away from the prying eyes of the court. When they entered the king's chambers, Isabel was struck by how much he had aged. He looked tired, worn, his face etched with lines of worry and stress. The weight of the crown, the burden of leadership, the constant threat of betrayal, had taken its toll. King Edmund greeted them with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Sir Gareth," he said, his voice weary, "Lady Isabel, what brings you to my chambers at this late hour?" Gareth stepped forward, his voice calm and respectful. "Your Majesty," he said, "we have come to warn you of a grave threat to your throne, to your kingdom." He presented the king with the evidence they had gathered, the anonymous letter, the reports from their spies, Lady Annalise's message, the testimonies of their informants. He explained the connection between Lady Lyra and Lord Barlock, their suspected motives, their potential plan to incite rebellion. The king listened intently, his face growing increasingly pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and anger. He examined the evidence carefully, questioning Gareth and Isabel, probing for weaknesses, searching for any sign of deception. "This is a serious accusation," he said finally, his voice low and grave. "You are accusing two powerful nobles of treason, of plotting to overthrow me." "We are, Your Majesty," Gareth said, his voice firm. "And we have evidence to support our claims." "Evidence that could be fabricated," the king countered, his gaze sharp. "Evidence that could be misinterpreted." "We understand your skepticism, Your Majesty," Isabel said, stepping forward. "But we would not risk our lives, our honor, to bring you false accusations. We are loyal to you, to the crown. We only seek to protect you, to safeguard the realm." The king studied them, his gaze searching their faces, probing their hearts. He saw the sincerity in their eyes, the conviction in their voices, the unwavering loyalty that had guided their actions. "Very well," he said finally, his voice heavy with decision. "I will take your warnings seriously. I will summon Lady Lyra and Lord Barlock to court. I will question them. I will investigate their activities. I will uncover the truth." He paused, his gaze shifting between Gareth and Isabel. "But if I find that you have deceived me," he said, his voice hardening, "if I find that you have made false accusations, you will face the consequences.
You will be charged with treason yourselves."
Isabel and Gareth nodded, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew the risks, they understood the stakes. But they had made their choice, they had taken their stand. They would face whatever came together. The king dismissed them. Outside the chamber, Gareth turned to Isabel. "We've done all we can," he said quietly. "Now, the flames will either be quenched, or burn everything," Isabel finished. The rebellion had begun. In truth. Chapter 18. Between Two Kingdoms. The king's summons sent shockwaves through the court. Lady Lyra and Lord Barlock, summoned to appear before the king to answer accusations of treason, were forced to abandon their carefully laid plans, their whispered conspiracies, their ambitions of power. They arrived at the capital separately, each accompanied by a retinue of guards and advisors, each outwardly proclaiming their innocence, each inwardly seething with anger and resentment. They knew that they were walking into a trap, that their carefully constructed web of lies was about to unravel. Isabel and Gareth remained in the capital, staying in a discreet lodging house, waiting for the king's judgment, their fate hanging in the balance. They knew that they were being watched, that their every move was being scrutinized, that their enemies were circling, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The king's investigation was swift and thorough. He interrogated Lady Lyra and Lord Barlock separately, confronting them with the evidence that Gareth and Isabel had presented, questioning their associates, probing their alibis, searching for any inconsistencies, any contradictions, any sign of guilt. Lady Lyra, true to her reputation, was defiant and cunning. She denied all accusations, claiming that she was the victim of a smear campaign, that Isabel and Gareth were motivated by jealousy and ambition. She used her beauty, her charm, her connections at court to try to sway the king, to cast doubt on the evidence, to paint herself as an innocent victim. Lord Barlock, on the other hand, was more blustering and less subtle. He denied the accusations vehemently, accusing Isabel and Gareth of treason, demanding their arrest, threatening rebellion. His arrogance and his threats only served to confirm his guilt, to strengthen the king's suspicions. The turning point came when one of Lord Barlock's closest advisors, a man named Sir Kester, confessed to his involvement in the conspiracy. He revealed that he had been the one to write the anonymous letter, under Lord Barlock's instructions, and that he had been working with Lady Lyra to spread rumors, to incite discontent, to prepare for an armed uprising. Sir Kester's confession was the final nail in the coffin. The king had heard enough. He ordered the arrest of Lady Lyra and Lord Barlock, charging them with high treason, punishable by death. Isabel and Gareth, summoned to the king's chambers, received the news with a mixture of relief and vindication. They had been proven right, their loyalty had been confirmed, their enemies had been defeated. "You have served me well," the king said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You have saved my throne, my kingdom. I am in your debt." He offered them rewards, honors, titles, but they declined, asking only for the king's continued trust, his support for their efforts to maintain peace and stability in the Western Marches. "I will grant you that," the king said, his voice firm. "And more. I will stand by you. I will support you. I will defend you against any future threats." As Isabel and Gareth left the king's chambers, they felt a sense of closure, of accomplishment, of having overcome a significant obstacle, of having strengthened their bond, of having proven their love. But they also knew that the fight was not over. There were still those who resented their power, who harbored ambitions of their own, who would seek to undermine their authority, to challenge their position. The kingdom was a chessboard, and they were players in a dangerous game, a game where the stakes were high, the risks were real, the consequences were dire. They walked from the castle into a city filled with uncertainty, caught between two kingdoms, the kingdom of the realm and the kingdom of their hearts. And both still were under siege, in different ways. Chapter 19. The Dawn of Reckoning. The execution of Lady Lyra and Lord Barlock sent a clear message to the realm. Treason would not be tolerated. The king's authority was reaffirmed, his power consolidated, his enemies silenced. But the undercurrents of discontent, the whispers of rebellion, did not disappear entirely. There were still those who harbored resentment, who plotted in secret, who waited for an opportunity to strike. Isabel and Gareth returned to Westmere, determined to maintain peace and stability in the Western Marches, to strengthen their defenses, to prepare for any future threats. They knew that they were walking a tightrope, that their every move was being watched, that their enemies were lurking in the shadows. They focused on strengthening the alliances with the loyal lords of the region, reinforcing the castle's defenses, training their troops, and establishing a network of spies and informants to monitor any signs of unrest, any whispers of conspiracy. But their efforts were not solely focused on military matters. They also worked to improve the lives of the people of Westmere, to rebuild the economy, to promote justice and fairness, to create a sense of community and shared purpose. They knew that a strong and prosperous realm was the best defense against rebellion, that loyalty was earned, not demanded. Isabel, in particular, focused on fostering a sense of unity and belonging among her people. She held regular audiences, listened to their concerns, addressed their grievances, and worked to resolve their disputes. She patronized the arts, supported local crafts, and encouraged trade and commerce. She became a symbol of hope, of resilience, of a new beginning. Gareth, as warden of the Western Marches, focused on maintaining order and security, ensuring the safety of the borders and protecting the realm from external threats. He was a just and fair ruler, respected by his men, feared by his enemies, admired by the people. Their relationship, tested by adversity, strengthened by shared purpose, blossomed into a deep and abiding love. They found solace in each other's company, strength in each other's support, joy in each other's presence. They were partners, allies, lovers, bound together by a bond that could not be broken. One evening, as they sat together in the great hall, sharing a quiet meal, a messenger arrived, bearing a sealed letter from Sir Reginald, the king's trusted captain. The letter contained disturbing news. A new rebellion was brewing, led by a distant cousin of Lord Barlock, a man named Lord Voren. Voren had gathered a force of disgruntled nobles, mercenaries, and bandits, and was marching towards Westmere, intending to seize the castle, to overthrow Isabel, to claim the Western Marches for himself. Isabel and Gareth exchanged a look of grim determination. They had faced adversity before, they had overcome challenges, they had defeated their enemies. They would do so again. "We will be ready for him," Gareth said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a cold fire. They immediately mobilized their forces, preparing for battle, sending out scouts, strengthening their defenses, rallying their allies. The people of Westmere, loyal to Isabel, stood ready to defend their home, their lady, their freedom. The dawn was coming, but it was not a dawn of peace. It was a dawn of reckoning, a dawn of war. Chapter 20. The Hunter's Embrace. The battle for Westmere was fierce and brutal. Lord Voren's forces, though numerically superior, were no match for the combined strength of Isabel's loyal troops and Gareth's seasoned warriors. The defenders of Westmere, fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom, fought with a courage and determination that surprised their attackers. Isabel, clad in armor, her father's silver dagger at her side, rode alongside Gareth, inspiring her troops, rallying their spirits, leading them into battle. She was no longer the frightened, fleeing woman who had sought refuge in the Whisperwood. She was a warrior, a leader, a lady of Westmere, fighting for her people, for her love, for her future. Gareth, his sword a blur of motion, his shield deflecting blows, fought with the skill and ferocity of a seasoned knight. He was a force of nature on the battlefield, cutting down his enemies, protecting his allies, leading his men to victory. He fought for Isabel, for Westmere, for the future they had dreamed of together. The battle raged for hours, the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the roar of the combatants echoing through the valley. The tide of the battle shifted back and forth, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked field, the defenders of Westmere, inspired by Isabel's courage and Gareth's leadership, began to push back. Lord Voren's forces, demoralized by their losses, weakened by their lack of discipline, began to falter. The turning point came when Gareth, leading a daring charge, broke through the enemy lines and confronted Lord Voren himself. The two men fought a fierce duel, their swords clashing, their bodies straining, their wills locked in mortal combat. Gareth, fueled by his love for Isabel, by his commitment to justice, by his determination to protect his home, fought with a strength and skill that Voren could not match. He disarmed Voren, forcing him to his knees, his sword at his throat. "Yield," Gareth commanded, his voice cold and firm. Voren, defeated and despairing, surrendered. The battle was over. Westmere had been saved. Isabel rode to Gareth's side, her heart overflowing with relief and gratitude. She dismounted and embraced him, holding him tight, her tears mingling with the sweat and blood on his armor. "You did it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." He smiled, a weary but triumphant smile. We saved ourselves, he said, his voice soft. Together. The people of Westmere cheered, their voices echoing through the valley, celebrating their victory, their freedom, their lady, their warden. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the battered but victorious castle, Isabel and Gareth stood together on the ramparts, looking out over their land, their home, their future. They had faced adversity, overcome challenges, defeated their enemies. They had proven their loyalty, their courage, their love. They had earned their peace, their happiness, their future together. Gareth turned to Isabel, his gray eyes filled with a love that transcended the trials they had faced, a love that would endure the test of time. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, and drew her close. "My lady," he said, his voice a low murmur, filled with emotion. "My love. My wife." And in that hunter's embrace, finally, at peace, the long hunt ended. And a new reign began. Epilogue. The years that followed were a time of peace and prosperity for Westmere. Isabel and Gareth ruled wisely and justly, their love for each other a source of strength and inspiration for their people. They rebuilt what had been broken, healed what had been wounded, and created a realm where justice, fairness, and compassion prevailed. They had children, a son and a daughter, who inherited their parents' strength, their courage, and their love for Westmere. The children grew, learned, and eventually took their own places in the world, carrying on the legacy of their parents, ensuring the continued prosperity and security of the realm. Isabel and Gareth, their hair streaked with silver, their bodies bearing the scars of battles fought and won, continued to rule together, their love for each other undiminished by the passage of time. They often walked the ramparts of Westmere, hand in hand, looking out over their land, their home, their legacy. They remembered the dark days, the fear, the uncertainty, the whispers of treason, the battles fought, the lives lost. But they also remembered the triumphs, the victories, the love that had blossomed amidst the turmoil, the bond that had been forged in the fires of adversity. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the land, Isabel and Gareth stood on the ramparts, their arms around each other, their hearts filled with a deep and abiding love. Isabel looked at Gareth, her eyes filled with a tenderness that time could not diminish. "We did it," she said softly. "We built our kingdom." Gareth smiled, his gray eyes reflecting the golden light of a setting sun. "We did," he agreed. "Together." He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, gentle kiss that spoke of a lifetime of love, of devotion, of shared dreams and shared triumphs. It was a kiss that sealed their legacy, a kiss that whispered of a love that would endure beyond the ages. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that mirrored the beauty of their love, the strength of their bond, the enduring legacy of Westmere. They stood there, silhouetted against the fading light, two figures who had faced adversity and emerged victorious, two souls who had found love amidst the chaos, two rulers who had built a kingdom on a foundation of justice, compassion, and unwavering devotion. And, far away, as if echoing through the stones of the castle, the wind carried a whisper of peace, a whisper of strength, a whisper of forever. The end.